I have been given the opportunity by Capcom to play Monster Hunter Stories 3 early, and I'm happy to report it's a big step forward from the previous title. While I can't talk to you about the full game yet, I can give you my thoughts on a good chunk of content beyond the demo. A full review of the game will be out on the channel at a later date prior to release, so please keep an eye out for that too. This video will not contain any story related spoilers or any major gameplay spoilers for that matter, but it will showcase a handful of monsters you may not have known were in the game, so fair warning. Right then, I'm sure most of you have played the demo or one of the previous games by now, and if not, you've probably watched other content on Stories 3 by this point. But yes, as it makes itself quite apparent, the Stories game break away from the traditional Monster Hunter format and instead deliver themselves as turn-based monster catching JRPGs. Your immediate thought to that description might be Pokemon clone, but it's not even close. If you are looking for a full breakdown on how the core mechanics function, I'll recommend you to watch my recent One Last Look at Stories 2 video. Today though, I want to focus on what's new rather than over-explaining basic mechanics. Right, well, let's start by talking about the visuals because you're already seeing them. The Stories game lean into timeless art directions, but the difference between Stories 3 and Stories 2 is there is less of a cartoony look and instead more polish. The world looks much more detailed, and that goes from the scales on monsters to even simple things like trees. There is great little attention to detail across the map, and one of my biggest issues with Stories 2 was the time you would spend traversing from point A to point B would often be quite dead. In this game, however, there is something eye-catching no matter where you go, without it appearing like clutter. And when you pair this with great new lighting, you're often led to these giant spectacle moments where the landscape unravels in front of you. On multiple occasions, I've genuinely found myself just flying around, just to admire the scope of what these maps are able to accomplish in what in reality is quite a small area. While the maps might not be too large in size, don't let it fool you. The maps are now using the space they have much more effectively by using verticality and even cave systems. This allows each individual map to be segmented into what feel like completely different biomes. You can follow a river down to a lake, enter a tree line to discover a forest full of detail, or even climb a mountain and overview the whole thing. And there's things you can go find out in the world too. Whether you want to go collect all the Poogies, look for some cool interesting treasure, or find hidden areas with a monster you might not have known was even available. There's plenty of things to go interact with in the world, and it's very intuitive to do so. Now in Stories 3, you can swap your monster out on the fly without interrupting gameplay by entering menus. So on 1 second I can ride my Palamute and jump from rock to rock, or I can swap out to a flying monster like Rathalos and glide down to a different area. And it wouldn't be a living, breathing world without the monsters that reside in it. Once again, building into this theme of space being used intelligently, monsters are very nicely scattered across each map. It's not a case of one linear path that is littered with monsters so that you can't get through without either having to carefully skirt around them. No, instead, every monster feels like it's where it should be. And there's a very, very good diversity of them available to you too. Now this is something you're able to see from the demo itself, but not only do we have a good variety of base monsters available, but by interacting with various in-game systems, you can even change the element of them. And I'm going to tell you this for a fact, you are going to struggle to settle on one team to run through on your game. More often than not, you're running into something that you just have to have in your party. Well, this feels like a good time to transition into combat, being as we're already talking about our party. I already touched on this earlier on, but the core fundamentals of Stories 3 is naturally very similar to Stories 2. We still have the rock, paper, scissors format with speed, power and technical, along with the various different monster element types. Pairing on top of that is the use of items, skills that buff, and all the different companions you can have fight alongside you, which will alter the way things go. However, there's a few new introductions to this game. One being the separation of kinship skills and stamina. In Monster Hunter Stories 2, for example, if you use the skill, that would detract from your kinship gauge. Now your kinship gauge is what you build up so that you're able to ride your monster and use ultimate attacks. What that meant in the previous game is a lot of the time you pretty much avoided using skills so you could build that up faster. But now you're able to do both. You can factor in skills with your strategy while constantly contributing towards your ultimate gauge to turn the tide of battle. And I've personally noticed there is much greater opportunity to introduce different skills into your team. The combat system is something I already praised to high heavens in the previous game, and it's only being built on further. But with that being said, I will be the first to admit it isn't without issues. Some of the previous issues with combat are still present here today, and in all honesty, it kinda has to be because that's just how the game is built. One thing being the guessing game. The first time you go fight a new monster, you have no idea of knowing what it does. You're going to need to guess which monster to have out with you, which type of attack, whether it be power, technical, or speed you need to use, or how cautious you need to be. Some monsters will simply unleash a team-wide AoE that is going to do big damage. In other instances, a monster will change its attack type on multiple occasions that is impossible for you to know at a first glance. This in isolation isn't necessarily a problem, because as I already mentioned, you as the player have multiple options to approach the uncertainty, whether it be setting up defensive skills, usage of items, etc. But Stories 3 also introduces a level of difficulty that can sometimes make that feel frustrating. Now, so far from the section of the game I am able to talk about, the general difficulty progression has a nice curve to it, but just as easily you can run into an opponent that is capable of one-shotting you if you get that guessing game wrong, and more often than not on those fights you are going to fail. We luckily now have the benefit of being able to go back into a fight relatively quickly rather than being sent all the way back home and having to do the run back. So clearly Capcom have realised that they want the experience of defeat to be a learning experience and part of the process. And if we view it from that lens, everything I'm talking about isn't necessarily a problem. I just fear that a new player may go a little off the beaten path and run into something that is going to delete them on repeat, and that may lead to frustration. So yeah, make use of the time to prepare. Go and find a good team that covers a wide variety of situations, and use the options available to play safe and observe your opponent's behaviour before just throwing yourself at it without even looking. Your approach to these situations will have a monumental effect on the outcome of it, and for me, that is an enjoyable factor. But that's enough about combat. So if you've watched that previously mentioned video, One Last Look at Monster Hunter Stories 2, you'll know that one of my main criticisms, as ironic as it sounds, was the story. It was very childish and the plot was driven by very simple devices. Character dialogue was largely uninspired. If you viewed the game as just, a bit of casual fun, something that you could play with your kids, then it absolutely did the trick and it was fine. But for someone looking to go into a game with the word story in it, hoping to find an intricate story, in all honesty I was disappointed. Capcom have now addressed this. Once again, I'm not going to go into details for the sake of not wanting to spoil you, and I'm also quite limited in what I can and can't talk about. But what I can say is the overall tone of Stories 3 is much darker. They have introduced maturity to the plot. And not only that, there is an overarching plot device that has you questioning what's going on and gives you the intrigue to find out why. In Stories 2, it was a case of, there's a big bad, let's go beat it so we can find the next big bad. In Stories 3, you can clearly observe something is building in the background. And not only that, the characters themselves have their own unique side story missions so you can learn more about them. It helps grow attached to characters rather than being just an additional gameplay asset. You'll find yourself with a favourite character in this game, which isn't something I could say about 2. And so I'm already quite confident in saying, even if the combat of these games doesn't quite tickle your fancy, there's still something for you to enjoy in this game. But on that note, I will mention another area of concern for some players might be how that story is delivered. Now, as it should be, the story is emphasised quite a lot during your initial playthrough. What this means for you as a player is a lot of cutscenes and a lot of dialogue. You can tell Capcom want to let this area of the game shine, which is great, but some of you might get slightly agitated by a somewhat regular interruption of gameplay. Once you go through these initial cutscenes and quests, the game does then open up for you to do what you want at your own leisure. Once you get to a new area, you can go explore every single inch and crevice of it. Now, you might be underleveled and unable to engage with everything to the extent you would like, but you can go do it. A comparison I would make is to Monster Hunter Wilds. A lot of people had the issue with how Wild's story was delivered because it felt very on rails. You couldn't go do what you want, you had to let the story guide you. And I think it's an adequate way of describing this game too. So yeah, if you're down to chill out, listen to a cool story, and watch a plot develop, you'll be right at home in this game. But don't go into it thinking it's some open world RPG where you can do what you want when you want right from the beginning. And that about wraps up my initial thoughts on the early sections of this game. A big thanks to Capcom for providing this key. I'm going to go right back to it as soon as I'm done editing this video. By the time you're seeing this, I would have already beat the whole game, and I'm already preparing for my full comprehensive review. If you have any questions about the early Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of Story 3, drop a comment down below. I might not be able to answer all of them due to restrictions, but I will try my best where possible. Keep an eye out on the channel for the full review. Thanks for watching.